The most common critique I get about this journey I'm on, or this process I'm going through to try and what I call think better, right? Be more rational, be super objective, try and understand all perspectives, avoid certainty, because on complex, important issues, certainty is usually your enemy. The biggest critique I get is, well, do you ever actually take a stand on anything? Do you ever formulate an opinion and have a belief on things? And typically, I'm actually okay with that critique, because for the reasons I said, I think on most issues, they are complex enough, they are nuanced enough that it's not as much as we want to believe it's binary or it's black and white. And that's, I think, a lot of the reason I get that critique. I'm okay living in the gray and saying, yeah, I feel strongly maybe about this aspect of it, but I can also see this side. I know it's uncomfortable, I know it's unnatural, but I'm okay with it, by and large. The fear I have, though, maybe one of the greatest fears I have about this whole process and idea of thinking better, is what happens in situations where the circumstance or the event or the action, whatever it is, the opinion, is one in which it demands a stance, right? And I'll give you perhaps the best example, the one that I always think about when I think about this fear, is slavery. Slavery, we can all say, or anybody that's reasonable, rational, I would say, should be able to say, sitting here in 2020, without a doubt, is objectively a horrible, horrible thing. Perhaps one of, if not the most horrific, shameful thing in our history as people, as Americans. The fact that we did it, that it went on for so long, that so many people were complicit in it, that it took so much to get it removed. And obviously there's still aspects of it that are issues today, but we can all say that objectively sitting here in 2020. The question becomes, what if we were sitting in 1795 or 1812, whatever it is, right? What if we were in that moment? And it's not all that different than this idea of, your house gets broken into, and how would you respond? Would you protect your family? Would you buckle under the pressure? Would you, cower in fear? What would happen when that moment really arrives? And people love to speculate about that and believe I would, do this or I would do that. But the reality is none of us know until it happens. And in this case, it's purely a hypothetical, because obviously we can't go back in time and know for sure. So I'm sure most people would like to believe that had they been alive during that time, they would have felt exactly the same way they do now. But again, we can't know for sure. And that question gets compounded when you think through the lens of how I believe we all should think. Again, certainty being the enemy, trying to understand all perspectives, trying to live in the gray and acknowledge that that's what it is. So what does that mean for me, right? That's what I often think about. What would it have meant for me if I lived in 1812? Would I have tried to understand the different perspectives? Would I have tried to understand that it's a long-running institution? It's got severe ties, significant ties to the economy, and the implications of ending slavery would be problematic. And there's so many people in the South that are tied to it and dependent on it. And it would just be so disruptive to change it. Some of our greatest leaders, Thomas Jefferson, had slaves. Abraham Lincoln's noted on record of saying, obviously he freed the slaves and wanted to, but there was a point in time in which what he cared about much more than that was saving the Union. And actually there's a quote where he said, if I could save the Union without freeing the slaves, I would do it. Now there's context involved there, but my point is, some of our greatest leaders in history did that. So who am I to think that I would have been better than that? And I worry about that a lot, frankly. I'm not trying to be dramatic when I say it's one of my greatest fears, because it concerns me. And particularly because what if that type of event happens again today? What if it's happening right now, in whatever form or fashion? What if it happens 2 years from now? What if it's already happened in my lifetime and I didn't spot it? I went through this process and I missed it. So I try and think about that as a test a lot, to think about how can I account for that? How can I protect against that? What is there to be done around it? And what I come back to is I try and think back to the basics of this process. And what you'll hear me say always is when it comes to a topic of significance, it's almost always a complex topic. And when it comes to a complex topic, certainty is the enemy. I say that because I think that slavery is not a complex topic. I know I said some things, just a bit ago of different justifications you could have made and all that. But I think if you truly go through this process that I talk about, think better, I think you would recognize there's not complexity here. This is one of those few instances where it, at its core, is relatively, if not, I guess not relatively, because it is binary, right? There is a right and a wrong to it. And as a quick aside, which relates to this, I had a conversation with my son today. He was doing some schoolwork, and he was learning about Egypt. So he had to create a pyramid, right? He had to make it out of Legos or draw it, that was the task in front of him. So he started doing it with Legos, and recognized that, hey, this is going to take a long time to do with Legos. So he told me, I'm not going to do it with Legos. I'm going to do it, I'm going to draw it. So, as I do, I pushed him a little bit on that and said, hey, listen, that's fine if you're going to do that, but understand why you're doing it. If you're doing it because you're being lazy and you recognize it's going to be hard and you just don't want to do that, that's not a good way to be. And he told me, no, I'm not doing that. I'm going to draw it. So I said, okay. I said, I hope it's a really good picture then. I hope you put forth your best effort. And he instantly began to question me and say, well, what do you mean by a good picture? What do you mean best effort? Like, what do I need to do? Do I need to color it in? Do I need to do this? And I said to him, listen, you'll know, right? You know right now what I mean and what it would mean for you to put forth your best effort. You don't need to ask me. You know internally what that is. And he got it, and he understood, and he drew a picture, and it was good. It was a good picture. But my point in that is, bringing it back to the slavery point, is I think, given in spite of all the flaws we talk about that our brains have and our minds have, and how they struggle with complex topics, because we need a singular narrative, we need a cohesive narrative, and biases come in, and confirmation bias, and all these things that cloud things, where we want to make it simple when it's complex. I do believe that our brains, right, in most people, I'm sure there's some that are just, wired differently or whatever the case is, but in most people, our brains it will recognize that. There is an ability for us to recognize when it truly is simple. And I believe it's kind of in the vein or spirit of checking your instruments that you will feel it, right? As I said to my son, you will know if you put forth your best effort. And I believe that to be true in the slavery case too. I felt it in different situations where I'm looking at a topic and you can just feel it. Think about that feeling when you were younger and your parents said they were disappointed in you. Or maybe they didn't even say it yet, but you knew they were gonna be disappointed in you. And you could feel it in the gut, in your gut. I believe that is the signal that tells you, like, hey, you know the right answer here. You know what it is. And particularly if you've thought through it and you're super self-aware and reflective and you have the luxury of having that as well, I think your brain will identify pretty quickly that that's that type of topic, and you'll be able to make the right decision. So I don't think this process of thinking better is necessarily at risk because of that, because you might justify things that are truly terrible. I think you, or for myself at least, will be able to spot that. The piece that gets interesting is, take a Thomas Jefferson, take an Abraham Lincoln. Obviously, I can't live in their heads, but let's assume they were similar. And they knew somewhere in their gut it was wrong. Why didn't they act on it, right? Because I think that's the second piece of it. It's one thing to know it's wrong. It's another thing to take action on it. And I would argue that's where this thinking better process and this journey of rational thought and objective truth, that's where this comes in. Because that's when you can begin to justify, like, well, what can I really do about it? Is it really something that we can change? I think that's the place where thinking better will allow you to do that more effectively. I think you might run into those issues I said before, where it's, well, what's it going to mean for the economy and how would this play out in society? There's so many people that believe in slavery. I think this process of thinking better will allow you to understand that other side, see the full board, and identify paths or solutions that might work. So conclusion being, I think the fear was warranted. It's an important thing to pressure test. But I believe that our brains are capable of understanding true right from wrong if we want them to. And this process of seeking objective truth and rational thought doesn't inhibit that. It helps it, and it helps us act on it once we've found it.